Welcome to the Food Loss and Waste Value Chain Selection Guide's Food Loss and Waste background. This presentation introduces key food loss and waste concepts to create a shared understanding for everyone participating in the food loss and waste value chain selection process. The goal is to prepare participants to actively engage at any stage of this process. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to demonstrate your understanding by identifying 5 main stages of food loss and waste and explain the 2 main types of food loss and waste, as well as give examples of the 4 types of underlying drivers of food loss and waste. Finally, you'll be able to suggest ways that food loss and waste fits into your organization's current work so that you can leverage your strengths and priorities to address this topic. On a global level, about 30% of food produced is lost or wasted. Also known as post-harvest loss, losses occur along the food supply chain from the point of harvest, slaughter, or catch to the transportation at the point where it reaches the retail level. Waste occurs at the retail and consumption levels. This can include restaurants as well as consumers' households. As food exits the food supply system, this also wastes valuable land, water, labor, and energy resources that went into producing the food to begin with. We're seeing an increasing demand for food as populations around the world increase, and we're seeing a greater pressure on our natural resources. By reducing food loss and waste, we can have more resilient food systems. This helps us to achieve a variety of UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 12 for responsible consumption and production, as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which can help us tackle the growing climate change problem. In order to scale food loss and waste solutions, this requires innovation and private sector engagement. There's a variety of different ways in which food is lost based on the type of food it is, where we see higher losses in fresh fruits and vegetables and slightly lower losses for cereals and pulses. Also, depending on where you're at in the world, will influence how much loss you can expect to see. Looking more closely at food loss and waste within a value chain, we see the first point of losses can occur at the point of harvest. From there, we can see evidence of losses at the storage and transportation and distribution levels. These 2 components can be combined into a single unit, depending on the value chain that you're looking at. We also observe processing losses along the way. This cuts off where we see food loss occurring, and we start to see food waste occurring at the point of retail and consumption. Types of food loss include quantitative losses, which is the sheer loss of weight or volume and how much is thrown away. And there's also qualitative damages. Qualitative doesn't really mean that you've lost the product entirely, but it may be decreasing in economic value, nutritional value, or what it's good to be used for. All of this leads to a loss of economic value. The FAO has a conceptual framework for food loss and waste. On the grand picture, we have the intended use in the production of food. This can be food for human consumption, feed for livestock, seed to produce more food, or other industrial uses or other economically productive uses. From this, we have the products that are intended for human food, and at this point in time, when we look at the destination, food with or without qualitative losses can be eaten by people, or if there have been too many qualitative losses and damages, it can go into other economically productive uses. For example, if green beans do not meet export standards, they can go and be used as cattle feed, which is not considered a loss or waste, as it's still contributing to some sort of economically productive use. On the other hand, food loss and waste is a quantitative issue. We look at the sheer volume of food that has been tossed or thrown away. Areas where we consider food as being lost or wasted include co-digestion, either through anaerobic digestion. It can be incinerated, sent to a landfill, or discarded. It can be used as compost or other waste uses, such as fertilizer or ground cover. Note that there are inedible parts to every value chain. For example, if we were to look at mangoes, the peel and seed of a mango are not consumed, and this is also not considered in the quantitative loss of food loss and waste. Digging in deeper to the specific direct and indirect drivers of food loss and waste, we can see a variety of examples of why food exits the system at different parts of the process. For example, during harvest, we may see machine or labor damages from improper picking or having a poor harvesting schedule. For example, green beans need to be irrigated the day before they are picked to reduce dehydration, and if this doesn't occur, you're likely to see more losses along the way. As for storage and transportation, if it's stuck in transportation for a long time or there's a long storage period that wasn't planned for, we can start to see losses here. At a processing and packaging level, we start to see losses take place because of excessive trimming to obtain a certain aesthetic. Again, using the green bean examples, the tops and tails of green beans are consumable, but this may not fit into the packaging at the grocery store, and so we start to lose some food there. At the wholesale and retail levels, we can see direct drivers of loss occurring because of overstocking, having too much on the shelves, or removing imperfect looking fruits or foods because they don't meet what we think consumers will demand. At a household and food service level, we see consumption. And an aspect of direct loss here could be oversized portions in which consumers couldn't eat them, or having poor storage or stock management in the home if you purchase too much food and it goes bad before you can eat it. We can also see indirect causes throughout this process. For example, at the harvesting point, we may leave produce in the fields because we don't have a buyer for the product. At storage and transportation, we may not have proper facilities. They may not be refrigerated, so we see greater losses there. At packaging and processing, there could be an inadequate supply if there's a glut of produce at a specific time, depending on the seasonality of harvest. At the wholesale and retail levels, indirect drivers include a variable demand for perishable products. So certain holidays may require additional food supplies that aren't seen through other parts of the year. And then at the consumption level, a multitude of data labels, and experience with cooking can cause a variety of losses. Taking a step back to look at the big picture of some of the underlying drivers of food loss and waste, we see structural issues that are impacting the technological, managerial, and behavioral types of losses. For example, a technical loss can be inadequate equipment. This can be tied back to the structural issue of not having access to financing in order to buy the correct crates needed for a specific product. Managerially speaking, there may be poor supply and demand forecasting and planning, or inflexible procurement requirements. Inflexible procurement requirements can be due to policies and regulations, especially if food is being imported somewhere else. They may have stringent and high levels where food is still safe, it is still edible, but it might not look right. And then behavioral, we start to notice within consumers and everyone throughout the value chain really, is their norms and attitudes, lack of awareness, and concerns of possible risk. We start to see a large influence of demographic in this area of what people are familiar with. Throughout all of this, food is exiting the supply chain due to deterioration, suboptimal quality, appearance, and having a lack of a buyer. I want to take this moment to introduce the country food loss and waste context. This is a template slide, and I encourage the food loss and waste team lead to fill this out ahead of time. This is a great opportunity to start doing some literature review and secondary data research to understand what is already known about food loss and waste in your country. This really starts to highlight two things. One, the lack of data that exists. This is a hot button topic. It is very important and has, as a cross-cutting theme, food loss and waste has impacts in many areas. But we don't always have the data to back up the cause and effect of all these aspects. And so starting here allows you to identify what's already known, and then what are those areas that we may need to dig into more during this process to compensate for what doesn't already exist out there. In addition to doing this at a country level, this can also be done at a sub-regional level if you're doing this for a specific part of your country. I would assume that the more detailed you go into a specific region, the less data you're going to find, but again, that in itself is a finding of what does and doesn't exist. The next template slide is for environmental conditions. These have a great impact both on the harvesting aspect all the way through to retail and consumption and how well food stays shelf stable and what some of those geographic issues are that may cause greater losses. For example, if you're in a more hilly and mountainous area, some of those infrastructure issues may become a greater issue. For this, I would really encourage you to do this slide for each of the geographies you plan on looking at to get a better idea of the environmental context you're building on, because the environment will have a heavily influence on the overall outcomes. I invite you to take a moment now to pause the slide and look back at some of the slides we've already discussed and see if you can answer some of these background questions. Can you pull out those 3 main stages of food loss, the 2 main stages of food waste, the 3 main types of food loss and waste, and then 4 key underlying drivers of food loss and waste? After we've kind of covered a basic understanding of some of the outline of food loss and waste, really try to dig deeper and ask yourself, what's the most interesting thing you learned about your country's food loss and waste situation? Is there something you would add or change or really would like to know? As well as what environmental conditions you feel are the most important for your target geography in terms of food loss and waste. A fun little game to also play is loss, waste, or neither. So you can go through each of these questions and ask yourself, would I count this a loss, a waste, or neither? And these answers will be discussed in the future sessions. Another aspect to consider is, what is your organization's take on food loss and waste going to be? So for this, start to ask yourself, why are you and your organization interested in food loss and waste? What are your strengths and priorities? What are some of those leverage points you have to really tackle these multifaceted issues? What is some of the work that you've already done on food loss and waste? I think a lot of people who work in agriculture have already been engaging in this topic, even if it hasn't been framed that way. So taking a time to really stop and think critically about what's your organization's role in addressing this topic really helps to engage throughout this entire process. First, I want to thank you for taking time to review the key concepts of food loss and waste and start to think critically about what role your organization may take in tackling this cross-cutting theme that impacts so many different areas of our lives. If you have more time and would like to dig in a little bit deeper into food loss and waste to understand this more, I highly recommend the United Nations Food and Ag Organization's State of Food and Agriculture report from 2019. This report focused on food loss and waste on a global scale, so it gives a good idea of where we're currently at and what is known and where some of those information gaps currently exist. In 2021, the UN Environment Program released the Food Waste Index, which helps us to understand more from a consumer and retail perspective where food at the very last mile is being tossed out. Also, if you get a chance to look at the World Resource Institute's Reducing Food Loss and Waste Action Agenda. This can help give an overview of how one may want to look at a different value chain to understand where food loss and waste is occurring and some potential interventions that could be helpful.